So I'm going to be talking about computational models of cognition with a focus on reverse engineering the heart of common sense in the human mind and brain. So there's going to be a little neuroscience here, but mostly cognitive science and AI and computational threads linking them up. And this is going to be sort of an overview of the work that we've been doing in our group, but also sort of more broadly as part of CBMM in connections with a number of other CBMM investigators. So I'll highlight those connections as this is going on. I think most accessible way in to try to understand what we're doing, which is fundamentally a basic science question. How does intelligence arise in the human mind and brain? But it's a science question in some ways approached like engineering. This is what we mean by reverse engineering. Namely, we're looking to construct models that ultimately are insight, right? I'm going to talk about experiments and how we test models, but like a lot of the folks that you're seeing here in the summer school, our end goal is not just a set of data, but an understanding in explicitly computational terms that are the same kind of terms that an engineer would use to build an AI system that does the same kinds of things. So that's what I mean by reverse engineering. And it's helpful to start from a pure engineering perspective and look at where is today's AI, because AI is all around us and here in a very big way. But I think it's fair to say that what we call AI right now in the broader world is really what I would call AI technology, but not real AI in the sense of what the original vision of the field was supposed to be about. So what I mean by that is that we have machines that do useful things that we used to think only humans could do. And now when machines do it, we call it AI. But we don't have anything like the flexible general purpose notion of intelligence or the kinds of common sense that I'm going to talk about that allow any one of you to do any one of these things for yourself. You may not be able to beat the world's best Jeopardy or Go players and so on, okay? You may not be a world expert at any of these things, but you can do any one of these things and you can learn to do them for yourself without having to be built by a team of engineers working for many years or decades in some cases at great expense. You just can do them. So what is the gap? To me, that's where I like to start in thinking about what are the interesting questions of intelligence that we're trying to understand in computational terms. And there's many gaps, but a useful frame for the work that I'm going to talk about, and I think for a lot of what cognitive scientists have been interested in, is to understand the difference between intelligence as pattern recognition and function approximation, and some other kinds of notions that we mean in cognitive science. So by pattern recognition and function approximation, I mean the things that are at the heart of modern machine learning. That includes neural networks and other approaches to machine learning, right? And over, I'd say a few decades now, and you see this, in its consummate form right now, especially in the tech industry, but also in a lot of other areas of AI and academia, you see neural networks as the highest version of this. But basically, it's an approach to thinking about intelligence where you start with a task, you construct a data set that represents the right thing to do to solve that task in a set of situations, and then you learn the patterns with some kind of function approximator that has a loss function that you use to optimize your pattern recognizer. And if you have enough data and you train for a long enough time, you minimize the loss, and that you can show, and both theoretically and empirically, that if I give you now new data that's similar enough to your training set, then it's a pretty good bet that your system will do the right thing most of the time there. That's sort of the conceptual understanding of machine learning. But that isn't the only way to understand intelligence. That's one way to understand intelligence, and it's surely part of intelligence in the mind and brain. But there's a lot of other things. And in particular, in cognitive science, we're interested in how the brain and the mind construct models of the world. So what underlies our ability not just to find patterns in data, but to really explain and understand what we see, or to be able to imagine new things, maybe things that we haven't seen yet, maybe things that nobody's ever seen. And then to use that sense of understanding and imagination to take goals and make plans to achieve those goals, and then to solve problems that come up along the way when you're trying to achieve those plans. Or the idea of learning as model building. So building new models of the world, maybe revising old models in response to successes or failures, maybe synthesizing whole new models that you didn't have before, or maybe that nobody ever had. So this view of learning is kind of continuous from what a child does, or a human adult who has a lot of expertise, or even like what we do in science when we make models of things that nobody's really understood before. Yet that is also part of human intelligence and the human ability to model the world. And then you can't leave out the social aspect. When we build models, we don't just do it alone, we do it partly by sharing with other people, through communicating through language and other means, and constructing models collectively and socially. So these are all the kind of activities that, or not all of them, but a set of the activities that we study in our lab that cognitive scientists have been interested in for many years. And we are not, I think it's fair to say, we are not close to having a full account of cognition in computational terms and all these aspects of model building. But we're making some really interesting progress, and I think that's what I want to try to convey here. If you want to read more about this perspective and how it differs, for example, from the more machine learning perspective that you see in deep neural networks and other things like that, take a look at this paper that was published a few years ago by several colleagues, Brendan Lake, Tomer Ullman, myself, and Sam Gershman. Gershman and Ullman are both also members of CBMM on the Harvard faculty, and Brendan Lake was an alum of our lab and so an early grad student in CBMM. He's now at NYU. Okay. It's a good sort of long general overview of some of these themes. I think maybe one way to concretize the gap is to reflect on the history, current state, and future of self-driving cars. So I don't know if you've ever driven in a Tesla or any other kind of car that has some version of approximate or partial self-driving, but it's a remarkable experience. It's amazing that you can take your hands off the wheel, you know, driving down the highway, or even I once did this when I was driving down to the summer school, and not in a Tesla, I have a fancy Volkswagen, but I've also driven a Tesla, but I took my hands off the wheel until it started to go off the road, and then I put them back on. I remember the precise point on the connector between the two parts of the two Cape Cod bridges where it made a mistake, but anyway. It's remarkable that, you know, especially in some of the more advanced kinds of self-driving that you see in Tesla, or some of the things that the Waymo, which is the Google subsidiary that's been working on self-driving for a long time, what they've managed to achieve, that, you know, they, even, for example, the Waymo company has, you know, they have cars that like actually go around without a driver in suburban Phoenix, I think, and sort of a taxi service. At the same time, it's also remarkable how much has been invested in building self-driving cars and how far we are from actually anything like full self-driving, you know, the thing that a human can do. Okay. There was a recent article in, this is an article on the technical side from the New York Times recently, but there was one in the Wall Street Journal on the business side, which estimated that the investment in self-driving cars is $80 billion, almost $100 billion, and we're far from the end, okay? And people have been working on this in the tech industry for at least 15 years, and in academia going back to the 80s. In fact, in the mid-80s, there was a car built by folks from CMU, which supposedly, I don't know the details, but drove much of the way across the country on the highways guided by a simple kind of neural network. So the prototypes of what you see today have existed for many years. But still, despite years, almost $100 billion, the activity of some of the world's greatest engineering companies like Google and Tesla, we are still far from having a complete solution to this problem. As this article in the New York Times reflects on, it talks about sort of the long tail problem, all the hard cases. So this is just the beginning of the article. Oops, sorry, my slides are behaving unpredictably. 7 years ago, Waymo discovered that spring blossoms make its self-driving cars get twitchy on the brakes. So did soap bubbles and road flares. So things that a human driver wouldn't think are causes to slam on the brakes, the current self-driving did. New tests and years of tests revealed more and more distractions. Their road skills improved, but matching the competence of human drivers was elusive. The cluttered roads of America, it turned out, were a daunting place for a robot. The roads of America are the place where robots are currently most deployed in ways that interact with normal people and potentially life or death ways, right? This is like real robotics in a way that is right there in the world. And yet it's really hard to see all the objects and know what you should do with them. So many different kinds of objects, right? Soap bubbles, road flares, spring blossoms, not just like, you know, chairs or tables or even dogs or cats, like a lot of what computer vision and cognitive science and neuroscience have studied, but all these other weird kind of things. Yet we have no trouble dealing with that. as humans, not as engineers. Or consider on the social side of things. Self-driving tech is not yet nimble enough to reliably handle the variety of situations human drivers encounter each day. It can usually handle suburban Phoenix, but it can't duplicate the human chutzpah needed for merging into the Lincoln Tunnel in New York, or dashing for an off-ramp on Highway 101 in Los Angeles. Okay, so how do human drivers navigate their way through merging traffic? That's a challenge in New York or Los Angeles, let alone places like in India where the challenge is far greater. I mean, I think it's a reasonable bet that when and if, let's say, Tesla achieves full self-driving abilities in the Bay Area, that car, if you just picked it up and dropped it in the middle of a typical urban scene in India, for example, where there's so much more complexity in terms of navigating humans, pedestrians, bicyclists, maybe animals, lanes barely exist in the same way in some places. It's unlikely, I think, a reasonable bet, it's unlikely that that system is going to be ready to handle that situation. Okay, but you can do that, right? Even if you've never driven in India, you know, it might be confusing and stressful, but you can handle it, right? You won't just throw up your hands and say, like, I have no idea what to do. Okay. I give these examples to point to some of the aspects of common sense that let a human driver do this. Our understanding of the world of objects, all their different kinds and forms and what they look like, and our understanding of other people's behavior, including, you know, situations when we're not like face to face, but I'm in a car, you're in a car, or I'm in a car, you're trying to cross the road, or there's 17 cars all trying to go in the same place, and so on. Okay. That's what I mean by common sense. And every human has it. Every 16-year-old, if you learn to drive in America, you know, you get your driver's license typically around 16. Every 16-year-old can get behind the wheel of a car with basically no training. There's minimal driver's education, depends on the state that you're in. In contrast, in some other countries, like I know in Germany, you have to take a whole year-long class, which might have something to do with why Germans are some typically maybe much more skilled drivers than a lot of Americans. But basically, it's okay. It's considered and basically is safe to just put someone behind the wheel of a car after they've done a multiple choice, 10-minute multiple choice test. That's what it is in this country. Okay. Not only a 16-year-old can do this with no training, but even a 6-year-old, more or less. I don't know if any of you ever did this thing called bumper cars, but when I was a little kid, this was one of my favorite activities at like amusement parks, were these electric cars that you have a little steering wheel and a little gas pedal, and there's like a rubber bumper around them, and you have a whole bunch of them, and they go around in a track. And you can do various things. You sort of encourage you to have fun by bumping into other people, and it's kind of safe-ish. You have a seatbelt. I don't know if they still have these. I mean, maybe there's some liability around it, but it was basically safe enough that they had them all the time. When I was a kid, I liked it because it was like pretend driving. So I didn't want to bump into others. I just wanted to drive, like race around as fast as I could. So some kids would always be trying to bump into me, and I'd be trying to avoid them and doing my thing. But again, you can just put a young kid here, and they can just go, right? They understand. They've never been behind the wheel of a car, but they know what to do. They understand the goals, the space, the physical relations, the goals of other people, whether it's to bump or to not bump. And getting the interface of the wheel and the gas pedal to achieve your goal, to navigate through the world, right? It's just amazing how you can do that with no training at all, right? No relevant data set or experience. So whether you're a 16-year-old, a 6-year-old, I know some family anecdotal stories of even younger kids who've been sat on their grandfather's lap behind the wheel of a car. When I told my dad about this, he said, it's not just 6-year-olds. Okay, so what I'm getting at is, again, it's just one case study of where human common sense allows flexible behavior. And if you think about what this would be like in engineering terms, you know, it's a totally different scaling path for building AI if we were to, say, approach not just self-driving cars, but so many other things we might want computers to do. Imagine if we could get them to do it the way humans do it. Okay. It could be much more efficient. Who knows how much money it's going to take before we have full self-driving cars? Imagine if we'd invested $80 billion in trying to scale up some of the ideas that I'm going to tell you about here. We might have a very different industry. Okay. So to get a little bit more concrete, and I'm going to just be zooming in on this idea and get a little bit more and more concrete and more technical. What we're talking about is what I sometimes call the common sense core, which is this notion that builds on a number of people's ideas. I'm giving you my version, but I'll cite especially some of the authorities who really helped to develop this approach. That from the earliest ages, as early as you can look, even a 3-month-old baby in some ways, already comes into the world prepared to understand it, not in terms of patterns of pixels or sense data, but in terms of an understanding of physical objects and their causal interactions, intentional agents, humans and others who have goals and make plans to achieve their goals, and how they causally interact in space and time. That's the heart of human common sense. And it develops early in infancy. You can show this behaviorally. You can also do this increasingly with neuroimaging. I'll mention some of that in a little bit. A lot of this stuff is shared with other species. It's not just unique to humans, but it's amplified and extended very much in humans, especially when it interacts with natural language. Natural language, the earliest meanings of English or any other natural language build on this stuff. Words and phrases are about these things. And then once you build an understanding of simple language, then that starts to transform and enrich your understanding of physical objects, intentional agents, and their interactions. Not to mention lets you understand a lot of things that no baby could understand because they aren't part of these core systems. Okay? The fact that these systems are shared with other animals gives us a hope of trying to understand them in neural circuit terms, because we're very limited in terms of what we can do with human neuroscience. But we can do increasingly interesting things. But it's important that these are shared with other animals, and we find, whether we look in humans or non-human primates or other animals as well, that there are functionally distinct systems in the brain that are present very early as we can look, at least in humans, and that are set up apparently to do these things, to perceive objects in these ways, to understand their physical causal interactions, to understand the goals or the plans or even the beliefs of other people or other agents. And the last point is in a sense, these systems are the glue of cognition, the bridge between perception, thinking, language, action, where all the aspects of cognition come together. In other words, they're the target of perception. This is what perception is designed to give us. They're the substrate of thinking and reasoning and our plans and goals. And when we learn language and talk about them, these are the things that we start off talking about. Although, again, language lets us talk about so many other things that no baby or monkey or bird could understand, right? So to illustrate a little more concretely, I'll show you some babies. So these are two babies younger than 2. The kid in the top is a 1.5-year-old. And this is one of my favorite demonstrations of an understanding of objects, but also how a kid can use their understanding of objects to make plans to achieve goals. So he's playing with blocks or cups in this case, and you can see what plan he has. So in a sense, you can kind of do a little bit of intuitive psychology here, but it's pretty familiar. He appears to have a goal of stacking up the cups, maybe to make a tall stack. And you also can get the sense that what he's doing, trying to make a little stack of 2 put on top of the stack of 2. If you watch more context, you can kind of see that. Maybe if we look here, he sort of tried to put those 2 together, and now he can put it on top of the stack of 3 to make a stack of 5. And it's a cool accomplishment. He's proud of himself, and we should be too. Yeah. Right. Okay. So he's going to keep going, but I'll just keep talking. You can see where extrapolate what he's trying to do. But think about the state of robotics. If you see, robotics has also made great strides in manipulating objects and getting robots to plan long-term goals. But we don't have any robot that could do this well at making a plan, executing it, debugging it when it goes wrong, and so on. Well, since he's just finishing the tower, I'll let him get to his climax so we can enjoy it with him. There's one last thing he puts on there. And this one deserves a standing ovation. You can see his motor control. Oops, sorry. His motor control is far from perfect. He tripped over. Robots sometimes do that too, and he, unlike robots, can get up again. Maybe some robots are starting to be able to do that. But again, it's still very far in advance of what today's robots can do. But imagine if we had something like that. This is an even younger baby. This is a 1.5-year-old, sorry, a 1-year-old, who is in a popular YouTube video especially popular because it has both a baby and a cat. You can see here he's also doing something with cups. It's a little bit simpler in that he's not making a stack, but he has this very interesting goal. He seems to have adopted the goal of trying to see how many cups he can fit onto the back of the cat. Okay? Interesting. Philosophers have long wondered about that question. It turns out to be 3, maybe 2. Once he sees that it's kind of an improbable goal, he seems to switch his goal, which is to get the cups onto the other side of the cat. Okay. I'm just going to pause here. So in this course of just the brief video, you saw at least 3 remarkable things. One is he made up this weird goal just for himself. Nobody ever told him to do that, I assume. He just decided to see how many cups he could put onto the back of the cat, and then he started executing it. Then, after he explored that for a little while and decided that he'd gotten as much out of it as he was going to do, he switched his goal. Like, he started pushing the cups to the other side. Like, I meant to do that. Okay, now that's my new thing. And then in the very last thing, which was neat, I'm just going to show the last moment here. Again, watch how he reaches back behind him to pick up that purple cup, right? You can see from the way he reached that he started to reach before he even turned around. He knew it was there. That object was in his working memory, even though he wasn't looking at it. But then, as is typical, he started to reach, and he turns around so that he can use his eyes to guide a more precise reach. So he knew it was there, but he didn't know exactly where it was, and then he looks to target his reach. Okay. That shows a particularly strong form of what developmental psychologists call object permanence, namely the ability to think about and represent in your mind objects that you can't see. And if you watch the whole video, you can see it's been at least a minute since he saw that object while he was focused on these other things. But somehow it was still there in the back of his mind, ready to be deployed when he had used up all the other objects that he was playing with and could see. So we want to understand how that kind of thing works. Okay? You can see similar kinds of physical intelligence in many other animals. Smart birds such as crows or parrots are increasingly a really interesting object of study, and they seem to be about as smart as anyone in terms of how they flexibly manipulate objects, especially as tools to achieve their goals. There's a few other cool YouTube videos here of the famous orangutan who makes a tower of Legos. I'll just fast forward through this. Over the course of the video, he assembles a really tall tower. There's a lot of controversy on the internet suggesting that actually this is sort of a fake video, that somebody made the tower and then the orangutan disassembled the tower rather than assembled it, and then they put it backwards on YouTube to make it seem more impressive than it was. But honestly, whether he's actually made the tower or just disassembled it, it's still pretty damn impressive. Like, you could have just knocked the whole thing over, but no, he either assembles it or disassembles it piece by piece. Or here you've got the famous mouse and cracker. Oh, we just passed the climactic moment. I first saw this in one of Christoph Koch's talk. Did he speak last night about consciousness? Did he show this movie? He showed it at one of these talks, probably on this very stage, maybe 10 years ago, or whenever we started this school, 6 or 7 or 8 years ago. It's very exciting. You watch the whole video, you see this mouse sort of valiantly and hopelessly wrestling with this cracker, trying to get it over the thing. He clearly has a goal and has a plan, it's just not working. But anyway, over the course of the video, he gives up a couple of times and finally comes back for one more try and finally gets it. And, again, here at the end of the video. Here's his last moment of giving up, but he eyes and he says, okay, I'm going to try one more time, and makes this last valiant effort and finally does it. And again, he can't clap for himself, but we should clap for him. Christoph, when he first presented this, said, clearly this mouse is conscious. I don't know about that. I actually think it probably is conscious. I think surely it is. But I think it's even more clear from this video that the mouse has a strong sense of objects as these real things, understands some sense about their physical properties, has formulated a goal which he could achieve. It's just really hard, and finally he manages to do it. Okay. One more set of videos on the topic of intuitive psychology, also from some studies with young kids. I'll show 2 videos, the first one on the left, which really highlight a set of results that were assembled starting in the mid-1990s with work that started from two Hungarian scientists, Gergely and Csibra. And Csibra's first name is Gergely also, so it's a little confusing. But there's also Yuri Gergely, who was one of his senior collaborators, Gergely Csibra, building on work by Amanda Woodward and a number of others that really identified as a target of study young infants younger than the ones I showed you, 12 months and younger, their understanding of the goals of agents. That includes like when somebody reaches for something that they actually have a goal to pick it up. Okay, and infants clearly understand that before they turn 1. But also these videos here that I'll show you on the left, you can understand an agent that has a goal without it looking like a human. It could just look like a little ball. So in this experiment by Southgate and Csibra, it was done with 13-month-olds, so basically 1-year-olds, but 13 months. They see this video like you're seeing here, and you could just see this as 2 balls rolling around, but you don't really see it that way, right? It seems much more like a story, some characters. If you were to describe what's going on here, how would you describe it in language? Sure, good. That's a typical thing to say. What about the red ball? Is it doing anything? Yeah, so there's sort of 2 goals here, right? The blue ball is catching or chasing or trying to catch the red ball, but the red ball isn't just sitting around or moving randomly. The red ball seems to be trying to escape. Okay, just one more question. Who do you think is smarter? How many? Okay, raise your hand if you think red is smarter. Red. Raise your hand if you think blue is smarter. Raise your hand if you think it's equal. Okay, all right. Well, so cool. When I usually use this, I make it a forced choice of red versus blue, and most people choose red. Here, about half the people chose red, about half the people said equal, and about half, and nobody said blue. So it still leans towards red if you had to maybe make a forced choice. What makes red look a little bit smarter? Or you can also ask what makes them look kind of equally smart. Actually, that's a great question. For those who think they're equally smart, why do you think that? The red ball. Right. Well, what makes the blue ball look less smart to people who thought the red one was smarter? The blue, yes. Is that what you said? Yeah. So the blue ball keeps, here, we'll watch it again. The blue ball keeps trying to sort of go through gaps that it can't actually fit in instead of kind of going around it another way. And not only does it make these bad plans, but it also doesn't learn, right? Like it keeps trying to go through those small gaps and it keeps not working. And part of our intuitive theory of intelligence is you should learn from examples, right? So that's a reason why you might say the blue ball is smarter, or sorry, the red ball is smarter, or the blue ball is kind of just not very smart. You might also say, well, maybe they're not equally smart because they kind of chase each other around and nobody succeeds, right? You might say, well, if you were really smart red, you'd run away and escape. Or blue, if you were really smart, you'd catch them. I don't know if anybody thought that or not. But in some work that actually started as a project by a summer student here, Marta Kriven, who's now a postdoc in our lab, she's actually shown that people have these sort of 2 different ways to assess the intelligence of agents. And I never quite thought about it in this context. She has a different set of stimuli, but one is like based on the outcomes, and the other is based on understanding the plans. And those are 2 different modes, and you can kind of use both of them. All right. The key that's illustrated here, as well as in these other things, which I'm not going to talk about, is this notion of efficiency. So what makes something look goal-directed, or how do we understand it as like smart or not in terms of its planning is, does it do something that efficiently and effectively achieves its goals? Okay, something like moving on the shortest path, but it's not just the shortest path in physical space, it's the shortest path subject to the constraints of the environment, right? It's the walls that actually make this look like they're goal-directed. If you removed the walls and showed the same video of the red and blue balls, but without the walls, it wouldn't look like chasing anymore, it turns out. I don't have this here, but just take my word for it, or I can show it to you later. It would look like they're kind of playing or dancing. They would look animate, they're self-moving, but the strong sense of chasing and fleeing is only coming from the fact of how they move through the gaps or move around the walls. And it's because they are basically pursuing a goal efficiently, or in the case of the blue ball, not very efficiently, but you still kind of get, it's like efficient subject to his weird false beliefs that he doesn't understand about the size of the holes. Okay, so it's efficient goal-directed action subject to your model of the world, their model of the world, which could be wrong in the blue ball's case. That's the heart of intuitive psychology, and even 1-year-old babies can kind of understand that, basically, in some form. The way we know this is you show them this video. You can't ask them or talk to them like what we're doing, but you show them this video, and then you set up something which is sort of a a potential violation of expectation or satisfaction of expectation, and you look at how long they look. This is the standard infant method for those of you who aren't familiar with this. When you show infants things that violate an expectation that you've set up, then they tend to look longer at that display versus what they expected. Okay, it kind of makes sense. Like when you see a magic show, if somebody does something surprising, you stare at it longer than if they just do something normal. And so here, the way it happens is, after this video goes on, the blue ball finally corners the red ball down in that little square on the bottom. And in the expected case, once it's kind of cornered it, it just goes up to it and catches it. No harm happens, it just catches it. Whereas in the other case, once it's finally got it in its grasp, it just kind of goes away and loses interest, and that's weird. So that shows you that, in some sense, that this is just one study, there's many others like this, but these kinds of studies show you that you've actually understood that thing as having a goal and you expect it to persist over time. Okay. One last video here, just to set some of the scientific context. This is from a famous set of experiments by Felix Warneken and Michael Tomasello, also with 1.5-year-olds, where you see this baby in the back here watching an adult do some strange thing that you haven't ever seen before, unless you saw it. And the baby somehow is able to still figure out what he's trying to do, and even how to help him. So after the adult stops, the baby goes, opens the cabinet, and you can see what happens, sort of steps back, looks up and makes eye contact and looks down at his hands, right? Watch it one more time. In a sense, he is effectively reading this guy's mind. Right? He's trying to figure out, what do you want? What could explain this weird thing? Turn that sound a little bit. And then if you haven't achieved your goal, but I understand what your goal is, how can I help you? And when I think you're going to put those books in here, and when he steps back and looks up, makes eye contact, and then looks down at his hands and the shelf inside, that's kind of a sign, right, that it's as if he's sort of showing or saying, maybe, like, I think I've understood what your goal is, and if so, I have a strong expectation about what you're going to do, which is, with the things you're holding in your hand, you're going to put onto that shelf. So he predictively looks actually ahead of the guy's motion to the expected target of the motion, which is putting the books on the shelf inside the cabinet. So this is a fairly sophisticated understanding of somebody's goals and how they interact with the physical constraints of the cabinet, right? That allows him to sort of work backwards and figure out what's inside this guy's head and how can I help him. All right. So that's all I'm going to say about intuitive psychology, but I hope also you can see that we don't have robots or AIs that can do anything like this right now, that can flexibly see an action they've never seen before and figure out what somebody's doing, why, and even how to help them. But imagine if we could. Imagine if we could have a robot that was as smart as this 1.5-year-old and as helpful and as cute, but even just smart and helpful. It would be quite remarkable and valuable around the house or in informal work environments and so on. Okay. It's that kind of understanding of each other and helpfulness that we just depend on it with the people we live with. Imagine cooking together or cleaning up, right? We just take that for granted, but that is the heart of human common sense. Okay. So I've shown you a bunch of basic abilities that, any human 1 or 1.5-year-old has, and that just sets the stage for where the computational work comes in. Our goal is to try to understand how these systems can be realized computationally, how they can be studied quantitatively, how they can be instantiated in neural circuits, and maybe ultimately the question of greatest interest is how do they build? Through some combination of evolution, development, and learning, right? And by learning, I typically mean things that happen, in a relatively shorter time scale in your life. By development, I mean things that happen over a longer time scale, like months and years in young babies. And by evolution, I mean kinds of, quote, learning or model building that happen not in your lifetime, but in previous lifetimes that are transmitted to you either genetically or through cultural evolution. Okay, that's also a form of evolution. And these systems are probably built through all of those processes working together. Any questions about this stuff? If not, I'll move into talking about how we actually try to capture these things computationally. Oh, well, actually, I'll just say one more piece of background, which I think is important. The idea of capturing the learning of these processes, the idea of building a machine that actually starts like a baby and learns like a child. This is one of the oldest ideas in AI. There's this famous paper by Alan Turing, which is most famous. It was published in 1950. And it was most famous for introducing the idea of the Turing test, which I'm sure you all know, and even the idea of artificial intelligence and human intelligence as computing. But how do you actually pass a Turing test or build an intelligent system? Well, Turing's best suggestion was we should do exactly this, like try to understand how children learn. Build a child brain, which is presumably much simpler, and try to teach it like the way children are taught. As he says, presumably the child brain is like a blank slate, something like a notebook as one buys it from the stationers. Rather little mechanism, lots of blank sheets. So easier to build, and then you teach it. Now, this idea has been around for a while. In many ways, almost every important figure in AI has suggested this approach at some time. Okay? We're certainly not the first here in CBMM to be working on this. Okay? But the reason why we think we can make progress on this is because all the ways we've learned that Turing was wrong in what he presumed, and many other people have been wrong too. So I just want to highlight the work actually of some of our CBMM colleagues, especially in developmental psychology and developmental cognitive neuroscience. Right? Turing was smart enough to know that he was only presuming what the child's brain was like. He had no actual scientific data. But now, after a few decades of very serious scientific work studying the minds and brains of babies and young children by people like Elizabeth Spelke or Rebecca Sachs or Laura Schultz, all of whom are key parts of CBMM, if we had a normal summer school, they would all be here lecturing to you, but because we have a reduced faculty along with our reduced students, you don't get to meet them in person. But they're some of my friends and colleagues and scientific heroes for ways especially like that Spelke and Sachs have shown with behavioral studies of infant intuitive physics and intuitive psychology, or neurostudies of the brain systems that support these, like in Rebecca Sachs's work, ways in which the starting state, what's built in to babies' brains, is just much, much more structured and interesting than just a blank notebook, blank slate. Okay? A lot of important architecture for the things I'm talking about is built in. And I don't have time to tell you the details of how they identify that other than the kinds of experimental behavioral methods I showed you. But check out some of the cognitive neuroscience work that's come out of Sachs's lab and also very much out of Nancy Kamwischer's lab, which you might see when Nancy Kamwischer presents to you in a few days. Or Laura Schultz has studied more like older children and how children learn, okay, including in babies and some of the older children. There's an idea that Laura and a number of colleagues have developed of what's called the child as scientist. So the core knowledge or core cognition, that's Spelke's term. The child as scientist is a term that was introduced by a number of people. Alison Gopnik is one of the main figures. She's not associated with CBMM, but still awesome. She was Laura Schultz's PhD advisor. Together, they and many others have explored all the ways in which children's learning is really this kind of model building. It's not just soaking up patterns and data, but actively forming theories, doing experiments to test out your theories like scientists do. We call those experiments play. Children playing in the crib or playing with their toys is a kind of informal experimentation, and Laura especially has studied how that works and how those mechanisms of exploratory play can provide the data needed to build your models. But you might say, as many of us know, it's often scientists playing around, like just exploring in a curiosity-driven way. It's where you make your greatest discoveries. Okay? So children, scientists, there's a lot in common. I'll talk towards the end about ways, I'll focus a lot on the first part, how we capture core cognition in computational terms, but a little bit at the end on how we're trying to think about the child as scientist, this kind of approach to learning in computational terms. So you'll learn more about my slogans here in a little bit. So with that as all background, let's dive in and say, how can we actually capture some of these core systems of like intuitive physics or intuitive psychology? And what we do is construct models, which I'm sketching like these pictures here. These diagrams, which I'm going to fill in now, tell you how we build these models. These are meant to be sketches of the mental models inside the kid's head of intuitive physics or intuitive psychology. So by intuitive physics, we mean an understanding of the latent world state and how it changes over time. That's what physics usually studies, and intuitive physics is the mind's version of that. But also how that's realized in perception, how the underlying state of the world gives rise to the sense data that you see over time. Now, in computer science, we have ways of capturing physics with like various kinds of simulations. We also have ways of understanding the causal processes by which things in the world give rise to images. That's what we call computer graphics, basically, and it builds, of course, on the history of optics and physics. And the basic idea is that your mind has versions of those causal models and then can use those flexibly to support inference, to see an image, to kind of work backwards to infer what was the structure in the physical world that caused that image. And we can understand perception as sort of inverting graphics. And then that physical state then provides the substrate for some kind of simulation, imagination, reasoning to think about what is likely to happen or what would happen if I do various things as part of making plans. On this side, this might look like a model of, I don't know, a basic kind of intelligent agent. You know, an agent has desires or goals, they have some beliefs about the world, they make plans of actions to achieve their goals, and then they act on the world, changes the world state, and they update their beliefs based on some perception. And to a first approximation, this is a reasonable model of how your mind works, or a lot of how it works. But that's not what this picture is. This picture is a model of your mind's model of minds, okay? So, you know, especially in neuroscience, we might say, well, the brain is far more complex. This picture is, at best, a high-level, rough approximation, okay? But this is a picture of the high-level, rough approximation that humans and even some other animals have built over evolution, development, and learning. Okay? And I would argue it guides a lot of how we do cognitive science and neuroscience. But the key is that this is the intuitive understanding of minds, and we can formalize each of these in computational models, where the idea is we observe kind of the things on the bottom. We observe an image at a point in time or multiple points in time, or we observe an agent acting and possibly their world state, and then we make inferences about the hidden parts, the gray parts. We work backwards to figure out what beliefs and desires would explain their actions based on the plans that I seem to see them making, and an understanding of how the beliefs respond to their state in the world, so intuitive models of the causal processes of perception and planning, right? So how are we going to build computational models of these structures that can support very flexible inferences based on what we observe or what we want to do? So one key technical idea, and this is what you're going to learn about in the tutorial with Kevin, is this idea of probabilistic programming or probabilistic programs. So this is a relatively new discipline of computer science, which is deeply connected with AI, but it's not just about AI. In the AI context, it's an approach to building models of intelligence that allow us to combine some of the best ideas of multiple eras of the field. So what dominates a lot of the current discussion in AI is the idea of neural networks, or these systems of what are sometimes called differentiable programs, right? A complex function which might take some input like perception and produce some output, and because it's end-to-end differentiable, you can use the math of calculus and the wonders of automated differentiation on a big computer to train with gradient descent a very sophisticated pattern recognizer or a function approximator. But as we've said, that's only one kind of technology for one aspect of intelligence. If we want to understand these aspects of model building and inference and imagination and prediction and planning, then we need these other ideas that are more associated with other areas of the field. So symbol manipulation, the idea of intelligence as manipulating symbols in some abstract programming language or language of thought or something. In a sense, that was the original good idea in AI, the early days of the field. It dominated the approaches people pursued in the 1960s, 70s, and even the early 80s. It then kind of went out of favor. It was blamed for being it was blamed for the failures of early AI to deliver on its promises, which were quite big, just as big as they are today, and still, also quite far from being achieved. But what early AI gave us, it didn't give us machines that were intelligent like humans. What it in fact gave us is computer science, and all of modern computing came out of early AI, basically. The founders of AI and the founders of computing were the same people. And it was long said that whenever AI achieved any success, it stopped being called AI, it just became called computer science. So for example, the algorithms for graph search, which your GPS system uses when you search and you say, give me a route and tell me the best route from home to Woods Hole, or how long is it going to take, or give me the shortest or the fastest route. For example, the algorithms that allow that, they used to be called AI, and then they were just so useful that people just called them, graph algorithms. But they were invented by early AI researchers, along with many, pretty much all of the standard programming language topics, as well as many of the ideas in parallel computing. And it's still the case that even though people, like especially if you talk to people in neural networks, people who have pioneered and really promote those as like the full solution, there's a lot of kind of anti-symbol talk, right? From people like Jan LeCun or Yoshua Bengio or Jeff Hinton. And these are great scientists and engineers, but I think we're actually far too harsh on symbols, because not only are symbols central for intelligence, but they're also central for deep learning. The only reason, the single most important reason that we have modern neural networks is not what you might sometimes hear that we have now GPUs. People will tell you a story like, we had all the math of neural networks in the 1980s, backprop, stochastic gradient descent in the 80s and early 90s. But now it works because of GPUs or other big compute things or big data sets. Those are enablers, but they aren't the essential factors. You can run deep networks on CPUs, they're just slower, though people keep accelerating them and making them faster. The one thing that is the actual sine qua non, the actual essential feature, is tools in symbolic programming languages, which are called automatic differentiation, which these are the tools that let you write a program in like TensorFlow or PyTorch, and you write a big complex network, and it automatically computes the gradients of that network. Back in the mid-'80s, when you wanted to compute gradients for gradient descent, I actually learned about neural networks from Dave Rumelhart, who was one of the inventors of backprop, and he would sit at his whiteboard and derive, using the chain rule, in his head, he would derive the gradients of like a 2-layer network or a 3-layer network. And if he introduced a new kind of unit in the network, like the way we have new units in LSTMs or transformers, multiplication networks, you could use calculus and figure out the derivatives. But it was not humanly possible for him or anybody to compute the gradients of like a 100-layer network, especially with all these complex new kinds of units that people have. It is only possible, it would be impossible to have modern deep learning without these ideas that came out of certain areas in algebra and control theory and programming languages especially, that allow you to automatically differentiate a program. The program has to be differentiable, but to actually compute the gradients in a tractable way automatically without a human doing it. That's the actual most important idea that makes modern deep learning happen. And that's about symbol manipulation. So the importance of this idea cannot be overstated. We wouldn't have culture, human language, or any formal languages of science or engineering, not just neural networks, if we didn't have forms of symbol manipulation that originally arose in humans through language and other forms of symbolic thinking and communication. So all of this model building and sharing, whether it's just in words or in math or programming languages, that's what I'm talking about. It's the most important idea in intelligence, so don't let anybody tell you that it isn't important to understanding human intelligence in the mind or brain. The third idea is the one that I grew up with. Yeah, question? Well, it turns out to be really subtle and challenging to define what is symbol manipulation and what do you mean by it? And I'm not going to try to do that here, although we could talk about it. I'm happy to talk about it. Because symbols can take many forms, right? There are simpler kinds of symbols and more complex kinds of symbols. But what I'm talking about here is the sort of thing that, is what you might call universal computation. So you could call it a Turing machine, although actually more effective is like any universal programming language, like lambda calculus, that's based on the math of lambda calculus, or any kind of higher order logic. So not just first order logic, but any kind of anything that's basically a system that is powerful enough to talk about itself. It may have other undesirable properties. I mean, if you know about the history of or the theory of logic and computation, there are certain reasons why people like, for example, more limited kinds of symbol processing in first order logic, closure and completeness and so on, and halting and all this sort of thing. But what I'm talking about is basically all the things that go from just very basic, like Boolean logic. Any kind of Boolean circuit is a simple kind of symbol. First order logic, where you can have like relations and predicates, basically like graphs, that's a more complex kind of symbol. And the most complex are like higher order logics or universal computing languages like lambda calculus. So I'm talking about all of that on the math side. And then you can identify things in natural language or programming languages or engineering that correspond to that hierarchy. Okay, I mean that whole hierarchy though, yeah. Okay, so the third idea, which is one that has been very influential to me and important in my work, it was kind of the dominant idea in AI in the 90s when I was growing up. So in between the kind of different eras of symbols and neural networks was a lot of interest in probabilistic modeling and Bayesian inference and graphical models, if you're familiar with that. It used to be like through the 90s and early 2000s, this was the dominant idea and tool set in machine learning. And it was also increasingly important in neuroscience and cognitive science. And a lot of my early work was about this. And I still think it's as important as ever. It's just where I've come to see is that like the real sweet spot or power is where all these ideas come together. But the distinctive contribution of probabilistic inference or Bayesian inference, and you'll see aspects of this in the work we're going to be talking about, has to do with how we make these inferences from limited, sparse observed data. All the cases we're talking about But almost any interesting case in cognition involves some kind of an inference, going beyond the data, using your prior knowledge to fill in gaps in the data, and only making guesses because you can't be sure. You can just make good, better, or worse guesses. So the math of how you do that, especially in the context of a causal structure, like these pictures here, where these arrows suggest a kind of causal thing, like the thing at the beginning of the arrow can be seen as the cause of the state and dynamics that comes out of the arrow. If we want to do inferences about the unobserved parts of these pictures, especially that require going against the arrows, like observing the output of a planner actions and reasoning backwards to figure out the beliefs and desires, the only or by far the best way we understand how to do that is some kind of Bayesian inference. But we need symbols, what we've come to learn, complex, sophisticated symbol languages to describe these models. And so that's where probabilistic programs come in, is it's really the combination of Bayes and symbols. But then also, we've increasingly found that by using the best of what neural networks can offer in terms of pattern recognition and function approximation, it can make that whole picture better as well. It can help make inference more efficient and faster, or it can help fill in parts of the model that we don't know how to express in symbolic terms, but can learn from data. So modern probabilistic programming is really the fusion of all these ideas. And there's a number of different probabilistic programming languages. I actually don't have on here the one that you're going to learn with Kevin, which is something called WebPeople. That's a very simple one, and it's very pedagogical, and you can run it in your web browser, but it's not like designed for serious engineering. But if you look at languages like Pyro, which was developed by Noah Goodman and colleagues, or a team that Noah set up, but was really led by some engineers at Uber AI Lab, back when that existed a few years ago. And the engineering team has now moved to the Broad Institute, just down the street from CBMM, where they're applying Pyro to bioinformatics and other kind of machine learning and biology problems. Or TensorFlow Probability, which is built on top of TensorFlow inside Google. Or GEN, which was built at MIT by Vikash Mansinga's group, and is particularly well suited to the kinds of things we're talking about here. Each of these really represents a way of doing some kind of Bayesian inference and symbol manipulation on top of a modern neural network platform like TensorFlow or PyTorch. Okay. So we now have a platform and ecosystem that really finally lets us realize the intersection of all these techniques, and it's a very exciting time. Okay. And this probmods.org is a web tutorial that will be part of what Kevin will show you later in the tutorial. Right. There's one other key technical idea here, which we need, which is to capture core knowledge, which is really about what are the kinds of programs that we're going to do our probabilistic inference on, right? These probabilistic programming systems are very general. They can take any program in a universal programming language and reason about it, and so on, okay? But the particular kind of programs we're thinking about get summed up by this slogan, the game engine in your head. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with game engines, and probably some of you even use them for fun or in your work. But in case not, a game engine was a kind of software that came out of originally the computer gaming business, which is a set of tools that allow someone to design a new game much more easily than they could otherwise, that allow them to focus on the characters, the story, the interesting new stuff of this game, the world building, without having to write like all of computer graphics from scratch, but allow you to have, to render nice, real-time, increasingly photorealistic graphics interactively as a player moves through the world. So the setting in which graphics, of course, works in computer games, it's different from like a movie industry player like Pixar. In Pixar, you render the movie offline. You might spend years working on a movie that's only going to be 2 hours long. But in computer games, it needs to be real-time. So the graphics are going to be less good, but the key is to make it look enough like the world that it's convincing and compelling and engaging. And increasingly, it really does look like the world, right? Or any possible world that somebody could imagine. And in the same way, we have these fast, approximate tools for modeling how light bounces off surfaces. We also have, for example, game physics. So here's an example of some simulations from a game physics engine, which can simulate in much faster than real time, realistic-looking, short-term future outcomes of very complex physics, like not just a few balls bouncing in a box, but like that wrecking ball hitting that pile of blocks. Again, if you were to try to solve the dynamics of that system using Newtonian mechanics by hand, you could, it's possible. Newton understood basically what you need to solve that problem. It's just it would have been as impossible as trying to derive the gradients of a deep neural network by hand. Just basically impossible. But a modern game physics engine lets you simulate that, lets you build that simulation and run it forward very efficiently, even faster, much faster than real time. And it does it by using the math of Newtonian mechanics, but kind of hacking it in various ways so that it runs fast. The result is that what you see there is not actually the physically correct outcome, but it's close enough. It looks plausible. And for the purposes of intuitive physics, we think it's more than good enough. I'm not saying that your intuitive physics uses exactly this kind of simulator, but the basic idea of a fast approximation to Newtonian mechanics, but also like fluid mechanics or other kinds of soft body physics that can be run for a very wide range of situations, faster than real time, and just to predict something like a plausible outcomes over a couple of seconds. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about, and you see some examples of systems that do that in these game physics engines. So the idea here, and the reason why we call this the game engine in your head, is that in contrast to actually a lot of the ways people use game engines in AI right now, you might have used them, is to build simulated worlds where you can deploy a learning agent like a reinforcement learning agent. And like a standard thing you might see in AI is you have a reinforcement learning agent that doesn't really know anything, but it spends a lot of time exploring some simulated world, maybe with some interesting graphics and physics, and it learns to act in the world. And then you can ask, well, could I transfer that? Can I see the simulator as like the training ground and transfer that to the real world and get that robot now to perform in the real world? And that's had some successes, but it's very hard. For example, OpenAI, which is one of the big industry AI labs, recently shut down their robotics program, which was based on that thesis. But they just said, it's just too hard. It takes too much data. It's just too hard. It's not going to get there. We're going to focus on the other things that are working a lot better, like the really famous and impressive GPT-3 and other related language and coding things. So OpenAI has done a bunch of really impressive things, but clearly their big success is on their big neural language models. Have you guys heard? I'm sure many of you have heard about these things. Has anyone taught this in the class? You'll see some more about this later on. But it makes sense that they're focusing on that, where they have, apparently most of the data they need to achieve their goals. Okay, but this approach of like sim to real for agents that engage in the physical world has not been nearly as promising. The idea we have, though, is not that. The game engine is not the training ground. It's actually a model of the model in your head. So when a kid sees these blocks and that bird on there and says, well, I wonder what's going to happen if I roll this ball, and they can do a simulation in their head and imagine with something like these tools the possible outcomes and decide that's either what I want or what I don't want, that's the idea we're talking about. Okay, so it's a different use of the game engine, and it's one that, as we'll show you, is much more robust than using it as a training ground, rather to use it as a flexible model in the loop. Okay, this is a good point. I'm now going to transition into actually showing you how we use all these tools to build some models of core cognition and some things about learning. But if anybody has any questions on the overall research program, this is a good point to pause. That's a great question, yeah. In our research program, we try to separate those. We try to say, and this follows the tradition of a lot of work in cognitive development and I would say in AI, but not all of it, which is, let's first try to characterize what we're trying to learn and then ask how it's learned. So our best understanding is that whatever allows a human adult to do these kinds of things is some combination of built-in structure and learned stuff. But in the work I'm going to tell you about, I'm going to start with systems that have no learning at all, show you how they work, how they can support the kind of cognitive and perceptual processes we're talking about. And then we can say, now how could you learn that? And I'm going to compare them with systems that are purely learning-based or that start with learning and show you, the standard learning-based systems like a deep convolutional neural network, which you could also train to do that, just doesn't work. So there's no point in trying to take that as your learning approach. Instead, we should take something which actually does achieve the goal and then ask how we could learn it. Okay. Does that make sense? So that's the approach I'm going to talk about. That's right. And a lot of what people call intuitive theories in psychology are often these later systems that are built on top of this. I think of the core systems as also, in a sense, kinds of theories, and at least representationally, but that's just an important, developmental psychology distinction. But the difference between like Sue Carey and Liz Spelke would say, call the intuitive theories the later things, and these things, these like core cognitive systems. But the significance of to me, of this, yeah, I mean, I might have said dedicated. I try to say functionally distinct because dedicated is a very big loaded word. They are functionally distinct. That's just empirically clear, but they get used for lots of different things. So I don't want to say like the intuitive physics system is used for a lot more than intuitive physics, but it's clearly a distinct system. And I think intuitive physics is a core thing that it does. But anyway, why is it important that there are these functionally distinct brain systems? Well, first of all, it's practically helpful because you can study them using techniques that would be hard if they weren't. And I don't just mean localization, but like decoding or encoding type analyses of human fMRI or ECOG data. Or if you go into monkeys, you want to know where to stick your electrodes, and the brain is big. But if you have a particular functionally distinct system where intuitive physics seems to be going on, then you can put your electrode arrays there. But more importantly, right, it seems to be related to things that are evolved rather than learned. So when things are learned, to the extent that things are mostly learned, right, then they tend to be in some kind of general purpose part of the brain, it seems, right? Whereas things that are evolved or build on evolutionarily machinery tend to be sort of in the same place in everybody's brain in ways that are shared across species. So it's the functionally distinct systems in ways that also have homologs in other species that seems to be consistent with the idea that these structures are also sort of built over evolution. I don't know. You're wrinkling your brows. So I don't think that's not core to my claim. I think a lot of people think that is reasonable. It's not really important fundamentally to understand what I'm doing. So if that seems objectionable, let's discuss it later. Okay. But that's why I think if you want to know why do I think it's interesting, I think that's part of it. Well, I'm going to show you, like the game engine, I wouldn't say a game engine area, but you can find networks of the brain that correspond to an intuitive physics engine. I'm going to show you that later. I mean, Nancy Kamwischer's lab, but in collaboration with me and others, found that. And there are also parts that you could understand as, I would say, a kind of intuitive psychology system, which Rebecca Sachs and Nancy and a number of others and some of our CBMM colleagues like Vinrik Friwald, who you'll hear from later, have found in non-human primates and studied. So yeah, I would say each of these different components would correspond to functionally distinct brain systems. But it's also true that if you look at a game engine is a big thing. And they separately have graphics engines, physics engines. Also, I didn't mention this, but there's something in game engines that is sometimes called game AI, which are limited forms of AI that allow you to have non-player characters that behave in some reasonable way, that aren't just like so dumb, but that like can interact with the player. For example, that can have a sense of perception around them and sort of, let's say it's like it's easiest to see this in like a shooting game or something, but to see if there's a player and I'm a guard at a castle or something and I detect you, then if I see you, if you enter my field of view, then I might pursue you or shoot at you. Whereas if you stealthily like walk behind me, then I won't notice you. And so it could be an interesting challenge for the player to try to hide from the guards, or to try to, if they go after them, to try to escape from them because they behave like those red and blue balls and you can understand them, right? So game engines often have tools for doing this. And it's interesting, this is just something that I just learned about the history of game engines. I'd known for a while that where the history of game engines came out of was basically, many of you might have heard of a game called Quake or a game called Doom. Anyone heard of these? These were the first-person shooters. And modern game engines, the first real game engines came out of level editors for these games. So basically, people had written editors that allowed players or other people to just like make new levels really flexibly for Doom. And then when they wrote Quake, which was the first really popular breakthrough first-person shooter, they specifically wrote it kind of in top of this level editor to make it very flexible. And then other people just started using this to make new games. There was a company called ID Games that did this. But the same team actually, their first game was a version of this game called Castle Wolfenstein, or Wolfenstein, which I remember playing on an Apple II, the first versions in the early 80s. which didn't have great graphics. But Wolfenstein was an instance of a game that's called stealth games, which actually are all about this, where like the goal is not necessarily to get into shooting, although the ID game version was really a shooting one, but where the goal is to like kind of get to some goal, to some rooms or explore some space without being noticed by the bad guys. So like you're like a spy or a ninja rather than this. But that only works if the game has built in some kind of simple agent AI, perceptual planning systems of the AI. It's not fun otherwise, right? So people have been building these capacities into games in general ways for decades, going back to the 80s. But now we have tools that are much more scalable that allow you to do this in bigger ways. And I would say, in a sense, the game industry over a few decades has recapitulated a lot of evolution. It's built in different terms some of the same kinds of basic computational machinery needed to model the physical and social world, but now it's deployed for entertainment purposes. But just as modern AI and neural networks has benefited from GPUs, which are the hardware side of the gaming industry, right? We, in what we do, benefit from the software side. And I think that's a cool convergence, because it's also the case that the hardware of GPUs was optimized originally for game-style graphics, but also game-style physics. So this isn't too widely known, but there is a less well-named PPU, or physics processing unit, which was also this idea of like hardware that was specialized for approximate physics simulation. And pretty quickly in the computer industry, these merged together. So modern GPUs are jointly optimized. Well, now they're optimized for neural networks, but 10 years ago or before, they were optimized for graphics and physics, not for AI, because we didn't know how to do that then. Okay. Anyway, so there's a really interesting history of how the gaming industry drove development of what I think of as both the software, some of the key software and hardware of modern AI. But that's not the story for today, although it's interesting to share that. I'm taking the liberty of having 2 lectures to do a kind of nice, gentle setup. But yes, I mean, I think it's one of the big open questions, right? I mean, this is clearly a software-forward view, not a hardware-focused one, call it algorithms-focused rather than a circuit-level focus. But I think we all agree here in CVMM that if you want to understand the mind and the brain, you really deeply only understand them when you understand how they relate to each other. And so I, as a cognitive scientist, come from thinking about algorithms, and computational neuroscientists will come by thinking about circuits or things that are most naturally mapped onto like a circuit level, like a neural network. But the really interesting hard questions that we're only just really beginning to make progress on is where those come together. But I'm taking this kind of more top-down approach, which complements a more bottom-up approach, and we will get to some of that stuff later.